Arts Conference. My name is Kate Clancy, and I'm one of the organizers of the CAC. If this is your first time joining us, you might find that our programming is a little bit different from what you encounter in other rooms in the convention center. We are an academic conference that takes place here at the heart of WonderCon and also at Comic-Con International in San Diego. We have programs that look like this that are on that table in the back if you want to grab one. It details all the programming that we've had throughout the convention in this room. It also, on the back, tells you our contact information. Like, in case you'd like to present with us in the future, you can get in touch with us to ask how to submit proposals. This is sadly our second to last panel. WonderCon goes so fast. What you said now, storytelling as a tool for healing in Black communities. And I'm going to pass the microphone over to Vanessa to introduce her panel.
Thank you so much. Also, can we just give another round of applause? She worked so hard to put
Absolutely.
all this on. She's amazing.
All weekend.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I know it's the end of a very, very busy, very long weekend, and we appreciate you taking this opportunity to share this space with us. We're going to introduce ourselves in very dramatic fashion. What I want to do first, though, just sort of set the vibe along with the music. I want to set the vibe in terms of this is not a lecture. People get talked at enough in the world. I want us all to think of this as a community conversation. And so if at any point, you don't have to wait till the end if you have questions. You can ask questions, you can share if there's something that moves your spirit and you feel like you want to share it with us in this group, please do so. The only thing I'm gonna ask is that you share it into a microphone because I can't hear and we like real far up here. And so I wanna make sure that not only I, but everybody else gets to hear what you say. So do we all feel good about that?
Yes.
You feel good?
We don't actually have a microphone.
We don't have a microphone.
Oh,
we got one right here, so you can come on up here and we'll figure out a way to talk to you.
I really can't hear. My bad. Awesome. Can we snap if we're in agreement of this?
Yes.
Appreciate y'all. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna do some intros. I'm gonna allow my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves. Dang, these pictures ain't low.
Rude.
That is rude.
Disrespectful.
We're gonna start with the incomparable David Walker, and I'm gonna get this together.
There we go. If you want to introduce
So I
yourself.
have to introduce myself.
Yes, please.
My name is David F. Walker. There, that's my introduction.
Come on.
I write comic books. I also write regular books. I also write all sorts of things. This isn't how I really talk. But I decided I'm going to talk this way during this panel, just as an experiment. But my name is David F. Walker, and I'm a writer. I'm, amongst other things, the co-writer of Bitter Root for Image Comics, the Eisner Award-winning graphic novel Black Panther Party, illustrated history, and but mostly I follow in the shadow of Mr. Victor Dandridge.
Whoa! Here we go. I guess it's my turn then. Okay.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Victor Dandridge, lovingly called the hardest working man in comics. I'm a self-publishing comic creator from Columbus, Ohio through my imprint Vantage Inhouse Productions. I'm also a phenomenological narratologist through my imprint You Create Comics, where we work on the storytelling philosophies of story making in comics.
Please, what was that again?
Phenomenological narratologist.
Please explain that to me. Please.
So phenomenology, like the study or philosophy of something, and then narratologist of storytelling. Yeah.
He's so brilliant.
This is a James Baldwin impression. If you guys don't know, he's going to do it the whole time. He's really good at it too. That's what makes it so bad. I love it.
And I'm just...
Don't you dare.
Just kidding. My name is Dr. Vanessa Hintz. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so I traveled far and wide to get here. I'm thankful to be here with you all. In addition to being a psychologist, I'm a professor and an equity and inclusion consultant. So when people are in a workspace or just wanting to know how to make their spaces, their workspaces, their clinical spaces, their educational spaces more equitable, they hit me up and they pay me to tell them how to do those things. I also have a podcast. It's called About That. And so if you appreciate anything that you hear today, please come up and get some information about the podcast. This is what I talk about all the time, every day. I love it so much. And again, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate you. Before we get into sort of like the bulk of the panel, I'm actually going to ask both of these lovely gentlemen to my left to answer this introductory question. And we'll start with David Walker. Can you tell us in one word how you would describe your storytelling style?
Healing.
That was good.
Ooh.
And I'm just going to add part two. What motivated you to become a storyteller?
I had no friends growing up, so I had to make imaginary friends. And then I had to come up with imaginary stories to adventures to be with them. And so, therefore, I became a storyteller.
Beautiful.
This isn't going to work, though. It's great for a dinner conversation or breakfast conversation, but in a moment, I will be going back to talking my normal way. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, yeah, no. How did I come to storytelling?
Yeah.
I think a lot of it was I was an only child, and just lived in my head a lot, watched way too much TV, read a lot of comics, and those provided an escape for me, a place that I really liked to be. But then at some point I realized that I didn't need to rely on other people to go to those places. That I could make my own escapes.
Yes.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
Victor, how would you describe your storytelling style in one word?
In one word, I would say it's exploratory. I think that's kind of always what I'm aiming for, is to put something down and see, does it still work a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now? Do I have something different that I've gleaned from it? Because I've been very fortunate. I don't know, David, if you get to do this. I get to divorce myself from my work very quickly. So once I write something, it's almost as though I've lost it. And so when I read it again, it's brand new to me almost every time. So it's very exploratory. Yeah.
And what motivated you to become a storyteller?
Control, actually. I'm gonna keep it a million.
I'm changing my answer.
There are things that I wanted to say, and through storytelling, I found that I had the most power in doing so. And so rather than wanting to ask for permission for the stories that were near and dear to me, it's part of the reason why I got into self-publishing. I don't have to ask. I can tell whatever story I want and allow it to, again, explore what those things will mean to me in the moment, later on, and then in the future. So yeah, thank you.
That was tight. If I had to describe my storytelling style, in one word, it would be unapologetic. And I think it's similar to what Victor is saying. I'm gonna say what I want to say, how I want to say it.
That's right.
And if it's not for you, then that's okay. And it is for me, though. And I think that as a Black woman, reclaiming that space is very important to me. And so I, unlike these two lovely gents over here, do not make sort of I'm not that type of storyteller. I tell stories in the trainings that I do, in the podcast that I do. That's the way that I communicate with folks. In the therapy that I do with people, that to me is narrative. And so I would call that style unapologetic. And I think what motivated me, similar to what David mentioned, is it is absolutely a space for healing, both for me and the people that I come into contact with, to be able to unapologetically and unabashedly experience joy and be yourself. I think is important, particularly for people who aren't permitted to do that in the world at large. So that is absolutely the type of, yes. Thank you. So this is how our panel is going to be set up. Again, we have what seems like a very long time together, but I'm sure we'll go by very fast. And so what we'll do is we're going to set some context initially just to give us sort of a shared point of departure for the conversation today, as we're going to be talking about dynamics of race, racial identity, and Blackness. We're going to start with contextualizing that because I don't want to make the assumption that everybody in here has the same understanding of what that means. So we'll start with some contextualizing of that, and then we'll get into sort of the crux of it, which is how do we use stories as tools for healing for Black people, to be quite honest. Does everybody feel good about that?
Absolutely.
And at any point, if you have a question, like I said, just raise your hand or shout out, and we'll get you a microphone some kind of way. Cool. Just kidding. This is the first thing I'm going to say before we get into it. And so conversations about race, conversations about racial identity can be a lot, particularly in, I would say, spaces where everybody can sort of be in their own space with regard to their own racial identity. And so I don't like to call these rules. What I do like to call them is understandings of how we will engage with one another in the space today. And this is taken from the work of Glenn Singleton, Courageous Conversations About Race, which is typically used in K-12 education. But I'm going to ask us all to just keep these things in mind. And the first is to stay engaged. Again, it's Sunday afternoon. People probably gonna be here for many days and nights, and maybe have many drinks and libations and festivities, right? Whatever way you engage, there's no right or wrong way to be in this space. So I invite everybody to engage in a way that is most authentic and most aligned with you, right? I also invite people to experience discomfort. Discomfort is a precursor for change. And so as a therapist, I'm gonna invite everyone to not judge whatever you feel in this space today, but rather to lean into that. Right? Feelings are not to be feared, and I'm saying that to myself too because I don't like my own feelings. Feelings are not to be feared. What I don't ever invite in a space, particularly in spaces where we're having conversations about race, is psychological harm. So if you feel harmed by anything that is said in this space today, I invite you to call me, to call any of us into that. Not call us out, but call us in to that because I want to remain open to learning and growing. Can we all agree upon that? All right, cool. Thirdly, expect and accept non-closure. This 90-minute conversation about storytelling in Black communities is not going to solve racism. It's not going to make anybody feel better about racism, right? You will likely leave here with more questions than answers and probably more frustrations. And again, I invite you to lean into that and not judge yourself for it. If you expect that you're going to leave here with more questions than answers, that sometimes can help mitigate frustrations. And then lastly, just to speak your truth. You are one of one. There's nobody else on this planet who has had your experiences, and so your truth is valid, right? It's not my job, it's not anyone's job to tell you that your truth is inaccurate. It's our job to offer perspectives. Does everyone feel good about these ways of engaging in this space today? Does anybody have any questions? Now I'm in teaching mode. Does anybody have any questions?
Preach on.
Cool.
You got it.
All right, then. We just gonna get into it then.
Yeah.
I will say the beginning of this is, I don't want to say heavy because I don't want to put that language on it if that's not how you feel. I will say, as a Black woman that does anti-racism work, this is heavy for me to talk about, and this is my job, right? And so being in the space, feeling as tired as I do and just a little bit hungover like I do right now, it's a lot. And so I invite you, if you feel like it's a lot, again, that's okay, right? That's okay. And y'all just feel free to jump in anytime.
We got you.
Giving a lecture.
Yeah, no.
Okay, now I have to go back to talking just like James Baldwin because there's some people walking that I have to try to impress.
There you go. I'm with it.
So we're going to start again with contextualizing a little bit about what it does it mean to be Black in America, right? We're going to talk a little bit about Black racial identity. And again, I'm a psychologist, and so a lot of the literature and a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are from psychological science, social science literature, things like that. And so again, I also want to, before we even start, establish that Blackness is not monolithic. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about being Black in America, we're talking about a perspective. It is not the perspective. Does everybody feel good about that? Mm-hmm. Make sense? All right, cool. And so when we think about what it means to be Black in America, these are some things that I'm going to invite us to keep in mind as we move forward. One is the sort of context of intergenerational trauma. And so ever since Black people set foot in this land, non-voluntarily, mm-hmm. right? There has been trauma, and that trauma has been encoded not only into our DNA, but into our ways of being. There's a tremendous book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, where she talks about how the horrors and the traumas of enslavement manifest in everyday life. And so for Black people who are descendants of enslaved Africans in America, that is something that we carry with us whether we like it or not, whether we see it or not, whether we can name it or not. It is encoded into our very genome, right? And it is also present in the ways that we behave and engage with other people in America.
I think one of the things that is important to kind of address with that is it's not just an invisible scientific concept, it's a cultural one. There's a lot of folks where as a statement of Blackness, how we respond to the world around us is different than our non-Black counterparts. And that is part of an evolutionary track and trait that we have developed through this intergenerational trauma piece, where what we see is something different than what other people see because they don't have the same eyes as we do.
Absolutely.
And that applies not just within like the larger societal structures, but also within the Black community itself.
Literally.
And we were talking about this earlier, just in terms of perceptions of skin tone and the ideas behind hair or where you go to church, what neighborhood you grow in. Mm-hmm. And all of this ties into the trauma that has been placed upon us, which is meant to always foster a divisive construct within
True.
our identities.
Very true.
Yes.
You are not truly black because of the color of your skin tone or because of how you talk. I'm here to squash all of that.
Absolutely. And one thing, just to give an example to the points that are being made, in Dr. DeGruey's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, one of the patterns of behavior that she talks about that she argues can be sort of directly linked to intergenerational trauma as a result of enslavement is ever-present anger in the black community, because literally for 500, 400 years, we've been fighting the same fight with what to show for it, right? And that doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress, okay, yes, and we're still working and fighting for the exact same things. That is infuriating, right? It's frustrating, and so it makes sense that we're angry, right? And so again, I invite everybody to read that book. It took me a long time to read it, actually, because I had to read it in sections, because it was a lot. But in addition to intergenerational trauma, just some things for us to consider as we move forward when we think about the experiences of black people in America. The wealth gap is something that I think is a sort of structural inequity that, because we live in a capitalist society, affects every aspect of our lives, right? The schools that we go to, the medical care that we can get, all different kinds of things. And the wealth gap, again, can be traced historically, right? So that's something to consider. And then lastly, in America, we tend to think about race in this sort of binary, the black-white paradigm, right? So like, blackness is the antithesis of whiteness, and we sort of forget about everything else in between to think about colorism, right? There's this sort of tendency to reduce race in America to like black and white, which is horrible. And so that's also something that for both black people and I think white people, it's something that we have to navigate, right? Does anybody have any questions about that? I just really feel like I'm teaching.
No, teach. That's what you're here for. Come on now.
I can project really loud. So
Okay, cool.
When you're talking about how that binary is reducing the trauma and everything, could that also not be argued that in and of itself, by making it a binary, that in and of itself is perpetuating the structural racism that has been going on?
Yes.
Because you're basically saying, oh no, you're just doing this because of your race and not because the system is actually still fucked up.
Yes, yes. And anytime we are reducing something and thinking about it with a lack of complexity, to me that is deflecting from the real conversation, because racism is insidious and complex. When we reduce it to a black-white binary, like, are we really talking about what we need to be talking about, though? We're not at
Right.
all. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, very much so. I have one more.
Yeah, sometimes we forget that whiteness is complex too, because the United States, because of its racial hierarchy, imposed race, all races of construction, on immigrants. And I grew up with stories from my father, who was born in 1916, about how he had to hide being of Scandinavian ancestry because the racial construction was he was a big white ape who was fit only for agricultural labor, a dumb Swede with a thick skull and a small brain.
Wow.
Well, it's a very interesting dynamic, because at one point Jews were not white, and Italians were not white, and Irish were not white.
Right.
But at some point they all became white. And that is the big difference between whiteness and blackness, is that the black folks still have yet to become accepted. And so it's always interesting that this America was built on one fundamental principle: we must have someone to oppress at all times. And as immigration began to spread throughout Europe primarily, and people came into the New World, they slowly but surely ran out of people to oppress, except for one group,
right,
or two groups per se. But some of the other groups that were oppressed, primarily from the Asian world, were able to close that wealth gap.
Right.
That black folks have always struggled to close. But it's when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're also talking about intergenerational oppression. There is nothing more American than oppression. That sounds really cool when I say
No, it does sound really cool, but it also hurts more. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I think this is also sort of to the comment that you're making, I mean, race is a social construct. It is also a complex social construct. And those social constructs have real life consequences, right? It influences the lived experiences of folks. And we're going to talk about such lived experience now as we move into talking about racialized trauma, racial trauma, race-based stress and trauma. And so when we talk about sort of how this manifests, right? And again, this is a perspective, it's not the perspective. It is a perspective with which to consider racialized trauma. And we're going to start at the very top circle and move clockwise. That's clockwise? I promise I got it.
It is clockwise.
That's
it's clockwise. You got it.
Cool.
You got it.
So we're going to start more often than not, particularly in today's day and age. Interpersonal discrimination occurs in the form of microaggressions. So microaggressions are everyday slights. They can be verbal or behavioral. They can be intentional or otherwise, but regardless of the intent, they communicate negative, stereotypical ideals about a certain identity group, right? So race-based microaggressions, one that I get often is you sound so smart. You sound really smart. Like somebody literally just this week was like, you're so articulate and professional. Like, why are you surprised? Don't worry, I'll wait. And so things like that happen all the time, every day. Or like someone commented to me actually recently, in one of my professional headshots, my hair was braided. And they're like, damn, you took professional pictures with braids?
Yes.
Why wouldn't I?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And those are microaggressions. And again, which can seem, I don't want to say insignificant, but they can seem like, it's not that big of a deal. But when they happen over and over and over again, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
It's as if you place one pebble in your shoe or in your coat, and it doesn't weigh you down. But after 10,000 pebbles in your coat, your back is breaking. And those microaggressions will, over time, hurt you more than the outward
ones.
aggressions.
Yeah.
Because so often the microaggressions come from people who are well-meaning, yet stupid as hell.
That's right. Like who missed the actual slice that they're giving, thinking that they're doing something. You are so articulate.
Exactly.
You speak so well.
Articulate.
Yeah.
The next person who says that to me, I'm going to poke them in the eye.
Yes, I'm gonna uppercut them in the face. And the last thing I'll say about microaggressions before we move forward is, I want to be clear too that micro in this case does not mean small. The STEM micro in this case means micro level of interaction, which means person to person. So microaggressions are not small, they occur in an interpersonal dynamic. And I think oftentimes when people hear microaggressions, they're like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, it's little. Micro means person to person. And so to David's point, we learn as Black people, as other marginalized people, to just deal with it, right? Because this shit happens every day, and so we just deal with it. We develop adaptive coping mechanisms, right? So I know what to do when I undoubtedly hear somebody say, wow, that presentation was so good, you're so smart. I know. So I figure out ways to deal with that, right? But again, once I get to 10,000 pebbles, there's nothing I can do. I can't cope with it, it's too much. And I use the example of when we first went into quarantine for COVID and everybody was doing all these things to sort of like pass the time, right? Like I'm painting, I'm baking bread, I'm like cleaning out the shed in my house, like whatever. People are doing all of these things to help like sort of cope with all this free time. After about 2 or 3 weeks of doing that, it don't work no more, right? Because now we're crawling up the walls, we don't like our families no more, like we want to get out, right? That is the exhaustion of coping mechanisms. And so in the form of, that is when race-based stress manifests, right? Is when we are just at the point where we're so tired, there's nothing I can do. I don't want to be strong anymore. I don't want to be resilient anymore. I'm tired. I just want to be able to be and to rest, right? That is race-based stress. And more often than not, when that occurs chronically over time, that is when race-based trauma manifests. So when we talk about the lived experience of racialized trauma, it isn't always something super traumatic and dramatic. It is the compounding effect of all of these different things. Does this make sense? People still hear me?
Yeah. And this is part of that intergenerational trauma that we experience and have these coping mechanisms for, whether that is something internalized or a cultural bit. That's just kind of marrying those two concepts so you can see them side by side.
Absolutely. Yes.
So there was a discussion about race-based stress leading to trauma. Can you also traumatize someone who's also Black?
Yes.
Because like you stated,
Yes.
taking your professional pictures with braids. I've done that before, and my mother had a conniption.
Yes.
Why would you do that? Why would you go on an interview with braids? You know, that's not professional.
Yes.
And it's like, ma'am, it's 2024. I'm gonna need you to sit down. You're old. That was the best
Respectfully,
Right, right.
for us not to fist cut. But it is possible.
Yeah.
Very.
I just want to repeat the question for people who may didn't hear it in the back. Is it possible for Black people to sort of
Inflict race, but yeah.
race-based stress and trauma on other Black people? Go ahead.
I think that perhaps, in many ways, sometimes we inflict it upon ourselves more.
Right.
Because there's this idea of Blackness that each of us holds, and we feel we can get away with saying things to each other that if a white person said it to us, it would lead to fisticuffs.
Yes.
I said fisticuffs to me.
That was good. That was good.
No, I think that's like we don't talk about that enough, right? We don't, like in the Black community, we don't talk enough about mental health, right? And so, I'm of a generation where if I say, oh, I'm dealing with depression or whatever, it's like, yo, man, you weak.
Right.
That's punk talk.
Right.
That's only women get depressed. I actually had someone say that to me.
Seriously?
In the last couple weeks, like, we men, we don't get depressed. That's women. That's weak shit. That's what someone said to me, and I was like,
That dude was depressed and he didn't know how to deal with it.
right.
That's what that was.
But so we tend to, a lot of times we inflict that trauma on ourselves without realizing it, calling into question, whether it's about hair or skin tone or how we talk or the neighborhood we live in. That was the thing, like, oh, you live over there, you're not really Black. You live on that
Right.
side of town, and it was like, as a kid, those sort of microaggressions just broke you down after a while. Like, what are you supposed to do with that?
Those are bigger stones.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah.
Because when you have a person that is non-Black, non-POC, and it's like, oh, you speak well, but then you have a Black person go, why you talk white? You're like, wait, so it's almost worse to you that I sound educated. It's super dismissive.
And I would say, just to sort of bring it back to Dr. Joy Degree's work, she talks about in post-traumatic slave syndrome that part of that is intergenerational as well. When mothers of enslaved children, when there were people coming around looking at their children like, I want that one, they would devalue their work, because if they didn't, that child was going to be gone. And so you think about the Black families and how it's like you always got to be doing the next thing and the next thing. It's never good enough, right? Like, you got an A, it should have been an A+. And someone would argue, a lot of people would argue that is a result of intergenerational trauma. Like, I'm not going to, because if I sort of honor and uplift your accolades, someone is going to come and take you away.
Right.
Whether that be the white folk or whoever, or the Ivy League or whoever, someone is going to come take you away, and it's not safe for you away from here. And so if I have to disparage you to keep you here and keep you safe, then that's what I'll do. And again, that doesn't make it right. It validates why
just blew
someone
somebody's
would behave
mind
that
over
way.
there.
I've been going to therapy for 3 years for you to explain something to me in 3 seconds. I'm sitting over here like, okay, don't flip out. We're still at WonderCon.
It's all good. It's all good. This is what this space is for.
When I read the book, it did the same thing to me. It was like really, and I went to a lecture that she did, that the writer of post-traumatic slave syndrome, and it really does. You like, suddenly there's these little things you're like, oh man, my grandmother did this to me all the time, and then you start to see things differently.
I just graduated with my bachelor's degree in linguistics.
Congratulations on that.
Congratulations,
Yeah.
And we're partying, we're having a good time, libations, and
Yes, libations.
my mother was complaining that, I gotta walk a lot of stairs. Bitch, this took me 5 years.
Respectfully.
Those were the inside thoughts.
I got you.
And then, I've got my professor shaking my hand. You did so well. You're so articulate. And it's like, okay, more stones. And I'm just, but, when I turn to her, it's like, you should be the main one cartwheeling and doing libations. And you're, it's cool or whatever. I don't do this every day. Right. And, now I'm looking at graduate school and I'm just like, the microaggressions continue. That's why I had the question, and now that's why my brain is melting over here. So
I'm gonna give you one more brain melt. I'm gonna give you one more book to read. Rest is Resistance by Trisha Hershey. That book changed my life.
I saw that on TikTok,
Do
and
it.
then it was connected to the rest ministry. I think
The Nap Ministry. The Nap Ministry.
Yes.
It will move you.
Thank
It
you.
will move you. Absolutely. And so I think, did this question come up earlier? We talked about what does it mean to be black, or what is blackness?
We were talking about that at breakfast.
But I think something that, this is a model of black identity, right? Dr. William Cross's model of nigrescence. And in psychology space, he's a clinical psychologist, so this is something that I remember when I learned about this in school, again, it was a bit affirming. And so, again, when we think about blackness and what that is and what that looks like, I'm not going to go through this sort of like in very much detail because I want to make sure we have time for other things. But ostensibly, according to this sort of process of becoming black, right, this is what William Cross sort of described, black people go from a space of, again, sort of like conformity in terms of, I'm just like everybody else. Like, nobody treats me differently. Like, if I just work hard enough and pull myself up by the bootstraps, I can be successful. And ultimately, you're smacked in the face with absolutely not. This is America. This is racist America. So even if you try as hard as you can, there's going to be barriers, right? And so ultimately, people go through their own process and their own way. There's no time limit, right? People go through this process of getting to a place where there's this place in the middle where you're just like, everybody else can kick rocks, everybody else can go to hell, it's only me and my people, right? Like, that's it. And arguably, Cross argues that we get to a space where we have a balanced view of racial identity, where we understand that we are who we are. As black people, we live in an oppressed society, and that doesn't mean all white people are terrible. It's essentially getting to that place where you have that sort of balanced view. And I share this because we're gonna move into talking a little bit about why it's important for stories to sort of demonstrate this sort of spectrum of blackness and not necessarily value or devalue one way of being black over another. Does this make sense? Do
Absolutely.
people feel good about this? Right on. Okay, cool. And so the last thing I'll say before we get into talking about stories, I promise, is everything that we just said is horrible. Thinking about racialized trauma sometimes, and again, this is what I do for a living, it is very overwhelming. There are times that I feel like, what is even happening right now? It is bone-crushing work, right? Because the issues that we're dealing with are so vast and insidious and baked into the very bread of America, right? And I'm here to say that there is hope. Even if that hope is the size of a pinprick, there is hope. And research indicates that for people of color, positive racial socialization can help mitigate the negative effects of racism. So teaching kids that black is beautiful, teaching them to love their blackness, teaching them to live and be in their truth, it doesn't solve racism, it equips them to manage it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that is why, when we talk about these stories, that is so important. Because we are providing young black and older black people with these positive representations of blackness so that they can, in turn, walk through the world, a world that we know is racist and inequitable, and be prepared to do so.
Right.
Does this make sense? People
Absolutely.
feel good about it?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to go real fast through these next ones because I actually want to get to the next part of this, so don't get dizzy if you look at the screen. Don't get dizzy, don't get dizzy, don't get dizzy. It's okay, it's fine, it's fine. It's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Because I want to make sure that we get to talking about the works of these amazing people to my left. And so what I'm going to say to sort of wrap up this piece of it, in terms of what is the utility of everything that we talked about, right? Like understanding blackness, understanding black racial identity. And there are two things that I want to point to as we move into talking about some of these narratives. And one is, it is important to be trauma informed. So to understand that for black people and other marginalized folks in America, we specifically talking about black people. For black people, just walking around in our skin is traumatic,
Yes.
right? And so when we are thinking about the experience of blackness in America, we want to be trauma informed, which is not reducing blackness to trauma. It is keeping in mind that that is part of the experience. The other thing that we want to do from a trauma-informed lens is understand that people's ways of being and ways of relating are influenced by this trauma. And so trauma-informed care asks the question, not why are you like this, but what happened to you? And so for Black people in particular, in America, and I would say globally, but that's a different conversation, for Black people, it is important for us to remain trauma-informed. Make sense?
I think there's something really interesting about that when you look at like Black cultural arts and the idea of how embraced it is by the rest of the world. Is it because trauma is such an actual part of our existence that when we find things that bring us joy, it is so great that everyone else can't help but find joy in it as well. Because if we can find joy in life, considering the state of trauma that we exist in constantly, then everyone else that experiences that cultural aspect of it is like, this is the greatest thing possible for that very reason.
Yes.
It was just a question. I don't know.
A rhetorical
Yeah,
question?
yeah, it was just throwing it out there.
Oh, okay. So,
I'll say yes.
Okay, all right.
I'll say yes.
Yeah.
That way it's no longer rhetorical.
Appreciate
it. No, I think that there's, like what Victor's talking about is interesting because I do think that, like, and this is maybe skipping ahead a little bit to what we're going to talk about, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think that the traumas that we endure and they happen on multiple levels, not just sort of just the trauma of being born is overwhelming, right? The trauma of coming out of the womb is what's the first thing that happens? The doctor smacks you to make sure your lungs are working and you're crying, but it's this act of inflicting pain. You've just been pulled out of what is probably the most comfortable space you'll ever be in, right? And so the trauma just begins from the moment we come out. And I think that, in terms of Black creativity, so much of what we do is in response to the oppression and the trauma that we've experienced. And what we're doing is we're taking that trauma and we're turning it into something else, right? We've turned it into jazz, or we've turned it into poetry, or we've turned it into hip hop, and we've taken these terrible things that crush us, and we turn it into something else, right? And that's all of human existence has been. But our existence in this country has been exceptionally conducive to that transformation, right? And I was listening to John Coltrane last night, and that's what that's what his music is. It's this transformation of pain and oppression into something beautiful. And even if you don't understand why you're feeling this way, this is what that is doing for you. Right. So I think that that's crucial also to understanding the popularity of so much of the art that we create. Right. Is that it's because it's all about healing, and everybody wants to be healed from something, even if we don't understand it, because most people don't understand why they're so messed up. Right. And it's all your parents' fault.
that's not wrong.
Because you got a doctor in front of you.
Free advice for the next
There we go.
40 minutes. We're going to transition now, and I'm actually going to punt it over to Victor to sort of lead us in this conversation about the wonderful work of Mr. David Walker.
Yes. When it comes to storytelling, and I don't know if you have ever met Brian McDonald, he's a phenomenal writer. He coined the term for me that storytelling is about survival information and how you pass that on to people in a way that we accept and embrace. And it's a natural part of human existence. And I think in so much of your work, David, you have actually found ways to express this survival thing in a way that is both entertaining, educational, and sincere. And the first work that we're going to talk about is Bitterroot, which you co-wrote as a project. And the idea of Black trauma being so rooted in this story and it being a source of healing is so very obvious. But it comes at a time and a point where it might not seem so obvious as to why we need that storytelling. So if you could give us the origin of Bitterroot as a project in the space of the, late 2010s, as opposed to the time frame of the early 1900s when it takes place.
Yeah, well, I was working with Sanford Green on a project, on something over at Marvel, and when that came to an end, he had the opportunity to do something at Image, and he'd been developing something for several years with another writer, Chuck Brown, and for whatever reason it wasn't quite moving forward the way they'd hoped it would. And I knew Chuck already. Sanford asked Chuck if I could come on board, and then we came together. And from there, Bitterroot began to transform. Initially, it was about a family of monster hunters. It was set against the backdrop of the Harlem Renaissance, but in that initial incarnation, the monsters were very much traditional monsters. It was like there was vampires and werewolves and zombies. Oh my! But both Sanford and Chuck kept talking about, but these monster hunters, they learned their skills while they were active in the Underground Railroad. And I said, well, wait a sec. If they learned these monster hunting skills during their participation in the Underground Railroad, liberating enslaved individuals, like what does slavery and what does the economics of Southern chattel slavery have to do with monsters? And they both looked at me with this sort of blank stare. And I was like, why don't we do something more with monsters? Because monsters have traditionally been a metaphor for something else, right? And I said, monsters in our story should be a metaphor for not necessarily hatred, racism, and oppression, but for the effects of hatred, racism, and oppression. And so from there, the story began to really take shape. And Bitterroot was about this family of monster hunters who hunt white people who have been infected by this curse. I call it the original sin of America. It was that they allowed hatred and oppression to take over their spirits in order to find survival, success, wealth, whatever. But our story takes place just at a time when Black America is now starting to suffer from its own disease. And that's the disease of the monsters that we turn into because of everything that's been inflicted upon us. Right. And so that's sort of, I don't know if that answers the question. But
absolutely.
That's the story of what Bitterroot's about.
No, I love it. And considering the panel that we did 2 days ago, where we were talking about Black horror, and the two gentlemen that coined a term that we got to talk about, ethnogothic, this is a great showcase. Yes, they are. If you guys don't mind standing up, John Jennings and Dr. Stanford Carpenter in the back. Yeah. The idea of this racial-based source of trauma being this contextual piece where you're actually getting to talk about this thing that horror is so apt to do, to talk about life through the use of monsters, but the monsters themselves are absolutely representational, I think elevates what Bitterroot was capable of, hence the Eisner wins that are so very well deserved. What was it like to kind of play around with these kind of deep-seated ideas for you as a writer, because it seems like so much of your work has kind of touched on these things, to do so in a space of comics that don't necessarily touch this as prevalently?
That was a difficult question.
I'm sorry, I got you there.
I mean, what was it like? I feel like I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility, primarily to explain myself.
Okay.
And then, but understanding, I guess if I'm fortunate in any capacity, that part of that fortune is that I know that when I express myself, I'm also expressing myself. There's at least one other person that's going to be like, oh, that's me. I get it, right? Like everything I do is trying to understand, like, who I am, how I got this way, and how do I navigate around it? Like I can't necessarily fix it, but I can learn how to navigate around it. Or like I say, I can learn the dance steps. I can learn how the song and dance works. And so for me, Bitterroot was a lot about just trying to work through my own anger and my own rage on a lot of levels. I was the only 6-year-old kid that I know of who was put in anger management and then got kicked out of anger management for fighting with the other kids who were all older than me, right? Wow. So that was it. Like, that's the one constant emotion that I remember being angry more than any other feeling. But anger is really, more often than not, displaced sorrow and trauma, right? We don't know how to process it, or we're raised in such a way you know, again, like I was raised in such a way, man up, you know, boys don't cry sort of thing. So what do? You get angry, you get into fights. And so that was part of what Bitterroot needed to be for me, was an exploration, and the exploration of those things. The horror stuff all became secondary, right? I'm not the sort of person who watches horror movies and gets scared. I've seen like 3 that have scared me in my lifetime, right? And when most people talk about horror movies, I'm like, yeah, that's not scary. Like a jump cut isn't scary. Like, you know, a cat jumping out of a bush going, meow, that's not scary. You know, scary is the end of Night of the Living Dead, when the dude survives everything, and then the mob still gets him.
Yeah.
You know, so.
And if I could just add to that point, what I appreciate about what you're saying is your willingness to explore those things in the development of Bitterroot allows us who now consume that to explore those things at a safe distance. So I feel like Bitterroot is something that I could use with people in session who are having difficulties, right? That we don't want to name outright. Like, let's not talk about the way that your boss is microaggressing you because maybe you're not ready to go there. We're going to talk about this family and what they're experiencing because there's a safe distance there. Right. And we're eventually going to work to talking about what is going on with you. But I think things like works like this allow us a bridge of connection to start having conversations that day one in therapy, we're not just going to be like, okay, and then what did your mom say to you? Like, that was horrible. We're not going to start there, right? Yeah. And so I appreciate your willingness to do this because it is then, I think, cyclically allowing other people to do it as well.
That's absolutely brilliant. If I can get personal, is there a monster in Bitterroot that you most identify with?
A monster that I most identify with? Yeah, you know, I mean, so there's 2 types of monsters. There's the Jinu and there's the Inzando. The Inzando are the monsters that black folks become. And the way we set it up in Bitterroot is that the family has foolishly for generations thought that they could cure the white people who are diseased, right? Right. When the reality is there is no cure, right? The cure only is within the individual, right? And so Bitterroot takes place, it starts in 1925 as the family, after over more than 100 years, is starting to realize, oh, wait a sec, this isn't working. And then this new monster comes along, the Nzandu. And the Nzandu is what you become when the hatred that you've experienced, when the oppression that you've experienced, when the terrors that you've experienced, essentially it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it turns you into a monster, and there's no cure for it. And once you've turned into that monster, you then have to it's up to you to figure out, how am I going to navigate the rest of my life as a monster, right? And I have this you know, it's not an optimistic feel-good philosophy, but I do believe that, you know, America turns people, the society turns people into monsters, right? We're watching it right now as it's happening especially with trans people. They're being turned into monsters by the mass media and by you know, political organizations. We see women being losing all control over their bodies, losing all control over reproductive rights, and essentially being turned into monsters, things, others, right? Yeah. And so to me, the Nzando is like, the Nzando is who I am the moment I get into a car and drive, and then a cop pulls me over. It's like, they see me as a monster. I run that risk, and how do I deal with that? And so, and in a lot of ways, it's more, Bitterroot is as much about my learning how to tame the monster that's in me, and that I think that a lot of us have to tame. And you know, we were sitting this morning, and I said, you know, so how hood was your growing up experience, right? And like, we've all had those experiences, those people that we grew up with who never learned how to tame their monster.
Yes. Wow. Whew. Yeah, that's powerful.
And that's the thing too. And sometimes that monster are your parents or your grandparents, people that you love very much, but they do things that, you know, because we all have these conversations sometimes, and you know, you'll say, yo, so like, you know, how many of your friends went to prison for murder? Right. And I was one time I was having a conversation with some business associates, and I said something about, yeah, you know, when my first friend went to prison for murder, and they were like, what? You know someone who's in prison for murder? And my response was, well, doesn't everybody? And then I realized, oh no, everybody doesn't have that experience, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, and I can't quite condemn this. I can condemn this guy for murdering somebody, but he's also been one of my best friends since second grade, right? And so I know what exists beneath that monstrosity,
Right.
And I also know a lot of what went into making that monster, you know, and again, that comes back to the intergenerational trauma, right? You get a kid who's raised by two parents and both of them are alcoholics. That does something to you. But then you have to ask yourself, well, why were the parents alcoholics?
Right.
What did they experience? And all that stuff piles up on top of us, piled up on top of me, right? I know piled up on top of some of the people in this room. And at one point or another, you have to go, okay, it's like the Incredible Hulk. It's why the reason the Incredible Hulk's one of my favorite superheroes of all time. Because he's a creature driven by rage. And, it's like, that's it. How do you control that rage? Because if you don't control it, it controls you.
Ooh.
That's very true. Ooh. Want to offer for anyone to ask any questions about Bitterroot? Has everyone read Bitterroot? Who has not read Bitterroot?
Dang, you just gonna
Okay,
make
that's,
people
no, because this is what it is. This is the opportunity for them to go downstairs, buy some books. Yeah, commerce, people. That's what we're here for. That's the America that we support. And we're going to drop that wealth gap. That's what we're going to do. But no, it's a great series for you to dig into. You actually have a big, huge copy of it. So you can see the scale of story that you would get and understand that there is so much to explore within this concept and storyline that is both very entertaining but actually very personal in its creation. My last question on this one, as three very different Black men, you each had something that you brought to this project, and did the experience of seeing these three different aspects of Blackness come together, does it affect how you tell this story in any way, shape, or form, or is it what you expected of how to kind of bring together these different voices for this project?
Well, it definitely wasn't what I expected, and I think that, there's the creation of Bitterroot is filled with a lot of microaggressions between the team,
Okay.
slinging sticks and stones that we didn't realize we were slinging at each other, and it's interesting too because we argue as a team. We've argued about a lot of things, and one of the some of those are really crazy arguments that when I look back, I'm like, why are we fighting about this? But then it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I was raised in, right outside New York City by a family who fled the South, who hated the South. And my creative partners are two guys from South Carolina who never left, and so sometimes we get into those kind of arguments over
This is what this means. This is what this means.
And I won't name which one of the two partners, but they actually said, well, we got to be careful we don't offend white people. And I said, I do not give two shits or three good goddams if I offend anybody, let alone a white person, right? And so those become the fights, right? It's like I'm an old man who spent his whole life being offended.
Yeah.
And if through my work, if my work somehow offends somebody, I don't set out to make it intentionally offensive or intentionally problematic to people, but I do set out to give it a level of truth that I feel is appropriate for this particular story, right? And if you are offended by it, that's really your problem.
That's part of the change that
And
needs
this
to
is
happen.
this is the arrogance that I project.
Not arrogance.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Do-
like, that's-
doctor's orders. If you're offended by it, lean into that
Right.
and think about why.
Absolutely.
And again, it's not to say you should or shouldn't be offended. Your feelings are your own. I just invite you, that's emotional intelligence, to be able to really understand why those are happening. You talk about controlling anger. That's emotional intelligence, is being able to have sort of an understanding of the complexity of why we experience the emotions that we do. And if it's offense or anger or lust, whatever it is, right? Being able to understand where and why those things are happening. That's emotional intelligence. And so, not arrogance, I think.
Right.
Great mental health advice.
And I love the fact that it showcases at its core the fact that Black voices are not a monolith.
No,
You have this difference of opinion due to circumstance, experience, things like that, and that will affect how you do tell stories and how that survival instinct kicks in for each of you. As people who left the South, to get out of the South was survival, and then for others to stay was survival. Those two things might not seem, too aligned, but you guys successfully told a phenomenal story within that. So thank you for that.
You have a question?
Maybe questions/comments, especially with Victor's, the comment you were just saying about the not being a monolith, like the three writers are not a monolith, but neither is the Sangre family a monolith.
Yeah.
They're each attacking in different sort of ways.
Absolutely.
And I found it especially within like the tensions between Blink and Maeda, right? That balance between maintaining tradition and maintaining this sort of like core identity, while Blink is also like, but I also want to move forward. I want to be a badass fighter. And sort of reconciling where those differences are. And I love specifically that moment where Maeda does show her fighting side, where she's got the badass like superhero pose, and where Blink finally sees that, where she's like, oh, okay, you have had this, but she's sort of like contained in that, and I think that gives Blink the edge eventually when she sort of becomes the leader.
And when Maeda finally realizes, I can't contain her, and why should I, right? Like she's the best of all of us, right? And that was that was interesting because in the original incarnation, it was like one of the first early fights we had as a team was like, who's going to assume the role of leadership within the family? And there were some people that thought it should be Cullen, and then there were some people that thought it should be Blink. And I was like, we've seen the story in which someone like Cullen becomes the leader, right? That's Luke Skywalker, right? We've seen that a bazillion times. That's Harry Potter. I was like, but that whole idea of, of a woman fighting back in the 1920s against what's considered the norms of gender, when gender was, defined by literally two genders, right? Like, to me, that was, as a writer, there's a challenge there. That's a story that we've seen something similar, but we haven't seen anything quite like that. And I love that dynamic between Maeda and Blink. Writing those two characters was a challenge for me, but it was really important because I felt like we're not seeing that type of story told that way too often.
Love it.
We're gonna do one more work, and then we'll sort of wrap up and make sure we have time for questions.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we went
we went there. We went there. With Nighthawk, based off of the Squadron Supreme, this character, in so many different ways, has, we'll say, analog, capabilities to him. You could easily keep him in this little space, and it's simple. But under your pen, things got real, very, very real, in a very fun way. But you didn't create this iteration of Nighthawk to carry it over from, it was J. Michael Straczynski's run.
Yeah.
What was it that you wanted to bring to this character that in this iteration was made Black, and now you get to bring a sense of Blackness to him that might be a bit more authentic than what J. Michael could do?
Well, I've never met J. Michael Straczynski.
He's a sweetheart, I promise.
I don't want to knock him. But I've often asked how many Black people does he actually know? Because he writes as if he's never met a single one. And he wrote this angry Black man that was very much the stereotypical angry Black man. And I was like, y'all don't know a really angry Black person. Like, you clearly you've never met one. And it's because the angriest ones don't yell,
right?
And the lighter they are, the lighter their complexion, the angrier they are, and the more likely they are to be sitting on the board of directors in your company and hearing your bullshit little microaggressions, and meanwhile they're sitting there plotting, chopping your head off, right? And so I try to take a lot of that and put that in there. But it was also. This wasn't the first series I wrote for Marvel,
right.
But it was the first series that I was hired to write for them. And because of scheduling issues, I started it before I started anything else that I was doing regularly at Marvel, but then the pause button got hit, I did some other stuff, and then this kind of came along shortly after my big debut there. But when they came to me, they said, oh, well, we want something that's dark and edgy. And I said, okay, I can do that. And then they kept going, well, not this dark, not this edgy, right? So there was that.
Yes.
But one of the things that I said to them from the very beginning was, I said, I don't believe it's possible, truly possible, for a black person to be a superhero in America. Mm-hmm. And I said, and they were like, well, why do you say that? And I said, well, because all superheroes really are is an extension of law enforcement, law and order. And that has been traditionally a tool of oppression used against black folks, right? I mean, the modern day police department is an offshoot of the old slave patrols, right? And so I'm having to give this crash course to all of editorial at Marvel and explain all this to them and explain why I'm making these decisions and like somehow miraculously a lot of stuff made it through the cracks in this story. It went through a lot of changes, and it didn't start out this angry. It didn't start out this dark, but then they kept asking me stupid questions, asking for stupid changes, and that there's a sort of defiance of like, oh, you thought this was too dark. I'm going to give you something that's 10 times darker, but I'm going to disguise it in such a way that you don't realize how dark it is, right? And it was down to, it was, if there's any hostility coming through in my answer, it's because this was such a difficult project to work on, right? And down to, I had one of the assistant editors say to me, Nighthawk he's so angry, and why is he trying to kill all these white supremacists? I don't get that. And to which I said, I'm not going to answer your stupid question. You need to do the research on your own and figure it out, right? And so, in a lot of ways, this was just me. I can only say after the fact, this was sort of me shooting myself in the foot at Marvel, right? I didn't do too much more work for them beyond this book. But it was also one of those things where, like, oh, here's an opportunity to do something that like no one's gonna remember.
No, we remember. We remember. No, we absolutely remember.
This is gonna be one of those legendary books. Like, after I'm dead, they'll be like, there was this guy, he did this series for Marvel, and it was like, it was the angriest thing of all time, and it was about gentrification and police brutality and da-da-da-da-da, and it was supposed to be 12 issues, and they canceled it after the first issue came out, and all this stuff. So, but to me it was really like, I'd been saying for a long time, I don't think, like, if you're gonna have a truly black superhero, African American superhero, like they can't really be on the side of law and order. I just kept saying that, and I wanted to prove that to myself in a story, and if he came across as an anti-hero or anything like that, fine. And so that's really what that story was. It was an exercise in me in showing again, like, I like Straczynski's Supreme Power storyline, and I liked, I can't remember who wrote the Nighthawk. There was an offshoot series. But again, all of those were like, you watch a movie like with black folks in it, and you're like, there ain't no black people like this. Right?
That's not the way this would happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so that was sort of my response to that. And it's out of print. And
which just makes it a treasure.
Yeah,
but I
it's a
think
treasure.
one of the things that makes it important, though, is through the lens of corporate comics, which are intellectual properties that are really kind of judiciously ruled for the value that is supposed to be in other media. You were able to say something very important, and it almost becomes metatextual in the context of your process of going through this story to what the story actually is, in the sense of that level of oppression, that being in the sense of law can kind of provide, so does being in a corporate space. And being dictated or mandated to what your creative outlets are supposed to be was kind of really something I thought, I always felt came through on the page was, how you navigate these constraints that your creativity is supposed to live within to write their character. When it comes to, finding your voice in such a space, you kind of hinted to it already that you took things to a level of darker, deeper, but more hidden. Did you find that the level of work that you had to do that was worth it in the overall because you were able to get across what you wanted?
Yeah, it's interesting because I will say that, I've worked for both Marvel and DC, and they both of those were difficult experiences at times for one reason or another. The Marvel experience at times, maybe because I wrote for them a little bit longer, wrote more stuff for them. There was always more challenges, but at the end of the day, I can look at what I did and feel better about. And part of it is just their editorial policies. Like, DC leans towards being really stupid. And I said that on the record, and if anyone wants to quote me on it, they do not promote intelligence within the books that they do and what they ask their creators to do. It's plain and simple as that. Marvel is not much better than that, but and then when you're dealing especially with black characters, right? Like I'm in my 50s, and I have never, no, that's not true. I've one time worked with an editor who was black.
Oh, wow.
One time. And I've never worked with a marketing team or publicity team or any black folks. So not only am I having to explain myself to editors and then explain to them what it is that I'm trying to do, then I'm also trying to explain to marketing and publicity how you sell this stuff.
Right.
And you would think the mistake you make is going and thinking, okay, it's not going to be a struggle, but then somebody says, well, why are all the bad guys white in your book? And it's like, well, because they're all, they're all MAGA douchebags. That's why, or something like that. But that having to explain to people, and some of the stuff that I'm writing now, some of the projects I'm working on now, get even deeper into identity and blackness. But it's like there's a reason why I'm self-publishing it. Because it's like I'm not explaining this anymore. I'm too old. I'm like let the audience come find it, but I'm not going to explain it to someone who's older. I'm not going to explain it to an editor or a publisher who is younger than me, young enough to be my kid, and who just doesn't have any sort of experience navigating these waters. And again, like I am trying to be a storyteller. But I'm also not trying to lecture you right now. Here's Dr. Vanessa's number. You call her, and she can explain to you why you're an idiot, not me.
I will. I will also say, I think to the point that you're making, I was just having this conversation with someone last night. People ask me sort of how I maintain like longevity, or like how do you keep doing DEI work like all the time. It's so exhausting. The exhausting nature of it is the repetition. It's not the work, it's the repetition, how I have to time upon time again, tell people why I matter, why my nephew matters, why my dad matters, right? Like, that is the part that it's like, this is exhausting, because you literally are trying to convince people that your feeling, your being, your experiences, your stories matter. So it's not, DEI is not hard, it's the repetition of the work, right? And so I appreciate what it is that you're sharing. I want to be mindful of the time, too, because I think we got like 15 minutes? 11 minutes. 11 minutes?
11, okay, all right.
10 or 11? It doesn't. It's the same for me. It's the same. 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so don't get dizzy when y'all look at the screen. What we're going to move into, Victor.
Oh.
We just going to continue with
my bad. Okay, all right.
I want you, because I think this is a tremendous segue in terms of, David, when you were describing what it looks like in sort of these rooms, these editor rooms at Marvel, DC, whatever, and Victor, a lot of the work that you're doing is in an attempt to not only diversify readership, but diversify creatorship. Is that a word?
Yes.
I just made that up. Creatorship.
It works.
So I want you to talk about that and what it is that you're doing.
Of course.
Just tell me how to go. I'm going to start right here.
Okay, no, that works. One of the things through my imprint that I really wanted to do, like I said before, was have a level of control. So I determined early on, even like early 2000s, that I would never stand in an editorial line at a convention to show a portfolio or anything like that, to have someone who doesn't know me and could be in any way, space, place, whatever, decide the value of my work. I never wanted to be that person. To me, there is maybe a traumatic sense of chattel slavery where I'm not trying to be on display in that way. What I always thought was the concept that would be more beneficial to me was to create work, and I could give finished work to an editor and say, hey, you can see if I'm, on par for what your company is looking for. And if I'm not, cool, but if I move enough units on my own, you're still gonna look at me anyway, because there is some aspect of me that you need or want. Through my imprint Vantage in-house, what I wanted to do was tell different stories that just kind of appealed to me. It wasn't about any sort of representational aspect, at least as I understood it then, because I always said that a Black creator is what I am, not who I am. And what I mean by that is I don't specifically create work that speaks specifically to Black people. I try to create a story that matters to me, and sometimes it will be through the lens of an obvious Black creative, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's just a great story that I just want you to read and enjoy. To that end, that's why so much of my career has been spent in predominantly, we'll say, more generalized comic book spaces. There are, Black comic cons. There are Black comic creator groups that I didn't associate in first, because my intentionality was I want to be a good comic creator, not just a Black comic creator. I didn't want you to be able to caveat me in any way, shape, or form. I wanted to be the guy that when you go, oh, do you know Victor? And everyone goes, yeah, I know who Victor is. It doesn't matter if you're a Black creator, young creator, old creator, whatever. Everyone could know who I was because I was accessible in that way. So the first things that we did with Vantage in-house, almost unintentionally, but also intentionally, was to create things based on readership. So we started with mature comics through the series The Samaritans, a bit more heavy and gritty. The context of it, how many of you guys saw Marvel Netflix's Luke Cage series? So it's like a multi-million-dollar commercial for my book. I just didn't have to pay for it. So if you liked that series, you'll love The Samaritan. I highly recommend reading it. But then we followed up with something a little bit more teen-centric with our series Origins Unknown, which also challenges how you tell stories. It's a series of first act pieces. So they all end on a cliffhanger, and the question always becomes, well, are you going to continue it? Well, that's not the point of the story. The point is, can I introduce something to you that you care about? Then we move on to The Trouble with Love, which is a little bit more young adult, a little bit more mature in its storytelling, but not too, hardcore, not too violent. And it's a superhero story that's not a fights and tights piece. It's more of a father-son breakdown of love and what it means to chase something that doesn't necessarily look the same way to everybody that sees you chasing it, which I thought was super important. It was very personal of a story to me. And last but not least, I looked at my all ages title, WonderCare Presents The Kindergardians, which literally I wrote that one because as I was doing more work in classrooms, or trying to through my You Create line, I had schools that are like, well, can we read your work? And I'm like, absolutely not. All these things are mature or, young adult. No, you can't have that. So I needed to create something that was kid accessible. And so the Kindergardians came about. And through those, aspects of creating things based on readership and just having a story that I wanted to tell in each title, I then saw that I could actually connect them like early DC, early Marvel, and see through lines that actually make it a shared universe. And so through that aspect of creating story and having these individualized pieces that, then I can kind of showcase, well, this actually connects here, and you can read this and you can read this. I have a bigger opportunity to affect readership where those kids that start with the Kindergardians, as they get a little older, I can introduce Origins Unknown. As they get a little older, I can do The Trouble with Love. And then they get The Samaritan and any other stories that I create in the meantime that intermix in between there. So I get to create a different aspect of readership than what we typically see in the corporate world, where IP is kind of a thing and they aim for a certain audience that tends to have grown up but kind of leave behind early readers in a way that I don't want to. That was a lot. I'm sorry.
That was tight.
Yeah, sorry.
That was tight.
Thank you.
That was tight. Absolutely. I want to also make sure we have space. I think we probably... Do you want to talk about unconventional?
I mean, I can. Okay, so unconventional is an outlet of mine where what I want to do is use my experience as a creative and as a thinker of comics, to kind of share different ideas for people for how they can approach being in the business themselves, whether that's as creators, retailers, anything like that. It's my critique on not just where we are, but where I think we can go. So one of the things I'm working on right now is a long overdue article. And I have an article series that's on LinkedIn. It's a written article series. And then I also have a vlog series that's on YouTube. So you can see different aspects of it. But the one I'm working on right now is actually having a conversation for independent creators today that go to conventions. And what we're seeing is that it's harder for them to move books. And that's a whole aspect where, it's finger pointing and saying, well, we can't do that because celebs are here, or we can't do that because print artists are here. And I'm saying the reason why you can't do it is because what you haven't figured out is that the book itself is an ancillary product that you need to move. You need to make community. And what ways can you build community through merch items and things like that we're seeing other aspects like kind of blowing up in the comic book or artist alley spaces. These are things that can be done for independent creators, specifically in the same vein of The Death of Superman. How many of you guys have read The Death of Superman storyline? If you look at the idea that Superman was failing as a title at the time when they did it, the fact that it blew up as big as it was, and it was blowing up before the actual merits of reading the story came out. It was the marketing material that was produced alongside of it. Those are things that we can take as independent creators, but we don't have those conversations enough. So that's what Unconventional is all about. How do you step outside the box and think about this business that we're in?
And I would just say, to sort of bring us full circle, it is important, Unconventional is important so that people 20 years from now are not walking in the same editor rooms that you had, where they looking around like, damn, this is hostile up in here. You know what I'm saying? And so we have less than 5 minutes. I want to make sure that if there are any questions that we are able to address those. We maybe have time for one or two. What questions do you all have? Yes?
Yeah, I was curious about the way there's a growing ban on books that are all controversial in terms of race or gender or whatever, how that affects you putting out the materials that you discussed just now.
For me, it's more of a likelihood that I will put those things out anyway and find ways to circumvent them. So one of the things that, I've done in the neighborhood that I grew up in, there is not a comic shop, right? Despite the fact that in my city, there are 8 comic shops. So I have literally a whole side of town that has no source of comic geeky anything. I put up some of my books for free to give access to it. So if there are bans in a place like that where they're like, oh, we don't want this content, I will make ways to give it for free so that people can actually still experience it no matter what. And the means of interjection or stopping it, usually in a digital space so that there's not even the limit of physical capabilities, I will make sure that people have access to it because I think that stuff is important.
Do you have any particular heroes in the creative area that such as, for my mind, it would be Walter Mosley. I would think that he would be like such an example of putting together a long-running series of an anti-hero in multiple genres and multiple media.
David Walker is mine. Yeah.
I'm my own hero.
Yes.
No, I like Walter Mosley. There's a lot of creators that I like, and to go back to your it's not my job as a writer to figure out why my books are banned or how to deal with it. It's America's problem, right? So I got a book coming out in October that's going to be banned in at least Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, right? But I'm never going to those states anyway. And so there's 47 other states in this country that need to figure out how do we deal with all those people in Louisiana, Texas, and Florida that feel the need to ban everything, right? And so I get like my job is to write the best books I possibly can. I can't fix all the problems that this country's having, but what I can tell people is we need to figure out this problem, right? I mean, my good friend Jerry Craft's books are the most banned graphic novels out there right now, and there's literally nothing bannable about
No
them.
reason.
Nothing whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so the problem, again, isn't our problem as a creator, right? It's that's asking black folks, well, how do we fix racism?
Come on now.
We don't fix it. White people have to fix it. They're the ones that created the problem, right? And so, we live in a nation, we ask, women, well, men have made all the problems that women are having in terms of reproductive rights. Like, it's men are the ones who have to fix it. We have to stand up, but instead, we still feel the need to oppress women and treat them as if they only serve one purpose, and that is to breed more of whatever monsters that we're trying to make to keep them down and to keep people of color down. And so it's very important that we don't look to the oppressed to fix the problems that the oppressors, because the system isn't broken.
Right.
The system works exactly the way it's designed to work. So what we have to figure out is how do we convince the people who've designed the system that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And in a most loving way, because otherwise, they get really bent out of shape. So,
Well said.
I'm about to throw a shoe.
Right, come on now.
Thank you all so much.
Yes.
That is our time. We appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the convention. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. You gotta end on that note.